Hey guys, welcome back. So far, we've taken a look at neurophysiology as it concerns the things such as depolarization and repolarization, the types of membrane potential such as graded and action potential. When we were looking at graded, we said it was a summing into axonal hillock, if you recall. When we were looking at action potential, if we reached a certain crucial level of depolarization called threshold, we would have an electrical event the entire length of that axon called an action potential. And that electrical event would stimulate calcium ion channels to open up at the axonal terminal. And we talked about the calcium triggering the release of neurotransmitters into the synaptic cleft. Well, this time around, we want to look at what types of neurotransmitters are there and what is a neurotransmitter by definition. Neurotransmitters are the means by which each neuron communicates with other neurons to process information and send messages to the rest of the body. There's some basic requirements to be a neurotransmitter. Now make sure you grasp these basic requirements because we're going to find that there's neurotransmitters that we would call something else if we were looking at it other than at the neuron and other than if they fit these requirements. The requirements to be a neurotransmitter include they must be found at the synaptic cleft. They must have a receiver on the surface of the postsynaptic surface. They must be able to produce an ionic influx when they bind to that receiver. And they have to have a way in which they can be removed from the synaptic cleft. Now, these neurotransmitters, when they are released in the synaptic cleft, can have a variety of functions. One of those functions could be excitatory. Now, when we think of excitatory, we're using fancy words, EPSP, which stands for excitatory postsynaptic potential, or they must have an inhibitory, or an IPSP, an inhibitory postsynaptic potential, depending upon their location and what nervous system they're found in. Now, direct versus indirect, they can have a direct effect by opening or closing ionic channels. Indirectly, they typically will have impact on the G protein linked receptors and lead to things such as second messenger activities that we've looked at using G proteins. Now, there's one other term associated with their function. It's something called neuromodulation. These neurotransmitters could be released and not cause an immediate or an indirect impact, but simply influence other neurotransmitters and make their impact greater. In that case, we would call it neuromodulation or a neuromodulator. Now let's look at the types of neurotransmitters that we could have. The first one that we could look at would be acetylcholine. Acetylcholine was the first neurotransmitter identified. It's found in the neuromuscular junction, and it's found in somatic as well as parasympathetic neurons, and we will find that it is digested by an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase. There's basically two types of receptors associated with acetylcholine. That would be the nicotinic and the muscarinic receptors. They can be excitatory or inhibitory depending upon their site. They can target the central nervous system as well as the peripheral nervous system. The second type of neurotransmitter that we can have is a biogenic amines. Now, the biogenic amines include our catecholamines. Our catecholamines include norepinephrine, epinephrine, and dopamine. And they can also include our indolamines. Our indolamines include serotonin and histamine. Now let's first take a look quickly at the catecholamines. Now we also find catecholamines when we're talking about things such as adrenaline, because as a group, epinephrine and norepinephrine fall within the adrenaline family. Norepinephrine is going to be excitatory or inhibitory depending upon location. It can be found in the peripheral and the central nervous system. It's a feel-good hormone. Dopamine is as well. It's a feel-good. Both of these can be blocked from being reuptake by cocaine, extending that feel-good sensation. Excessive amounts of dopamine can lead to schizophrenia. Deficiencies of dopamine are found in people that have Parkinson's disorder. Indolamines, again, is serotonin. The lack of the receptors we will find in Alzheimer's, for instance. And then finally, we got histamine associated with the biogenic amines. That is an indolamine. And histamine, if we find it in the immune system, is associated with inflammatory. When we find it as a neurotransmitter, it's going to be important in wakefulness, appetite control, and learning and memory in the central nervous system. The third type of neurotransmitter we have is the amino acids. Now, yes, these are the same amino acids that would play a role in building proteins, but if they are found in the neuron and released from the axonal end of a neuron, they're known as neurotransmitters. They play a role in the central nervous system, and they include such amino acids GABA, glutamate, and glycine. GABA stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid. Now take a look at GABA and glycine first. They both are inhibitory neurotransmitters found in the central nervous system. GABA is the principal inhibitory neuron in the brain, whereas glycine is going to be the principal inhibitory neuron in the spinal cord. Glutamate is going to be an excitatory amino acid neurotransmitter. It's going to be found in the central nervous system. It's going to be important in learning and memory. But note that it is also known as the stroke neurotransmitter, and that is because during a stroke we find an excessive release of glutamate within the brain, and it actually triggers neurons to literally them to die. The fourth type of neurotransmitter are peptides. There's two major classes of peptides, and yes, peptides are two or more amino acids chemically linked together. These peptides include endorphins and encephalins. Now, in both instances, when we're looking at endorphins and we're looking at encephalins, they typically are going to help us manage our body during stressful situations or painful situations. The endorphins are typically thought of as the natural opiate. They're the neurotransmitters that are going to be released when joggers are running. It's the jogger's high. It's also they're stimulated to be released when smokers are smoking and during activities such as acupuncture. Look at the endorphins, you find that they are found primarily in the central nervous system, and their primary role is to inhibit pain. Encephalins are typically 5 to 10 amino acid opiates. They have a euphoric effect that increases dramatically in ladies who are pregnant when they're going through labor. They're what helps the lady during labor pains. They reduce perception of pain, stress, and they are the ones that will kick in during shock sensations. And finally, we have our novel messengers. Our novel messengers are a gamut of different types of molecules. They range from ATP and the adenosine itself, which are typically identified as purines, and they also include gases such as nitric oxide and carbon monoxide. If you take a look first at the purines, you find ATP and you find adenosine. Yes, this is the same energy molecule. ATP can be inhibitory or excitatory depending upon location. Take a look finally at nitric oxide. It's excitatory or inhibitory. It's found in the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, and notice that its release potentiates stroke damage. It is probably the most damaging neurotransmitter that we have in the central nervous system during a stroke event. Now you guys please take a look at these charts, learn a little bit about these particular neurotransmitters, and appreciate that these are not the only neurotransmitters. They're just the only ones that want to ask you to know for the test. Y'all have a great day. Be safe out there. See you soon.